What are the top programming languages to get a job as a software engineer today? Hey everybody, my name's Luke. Exponent is a platform that helps you ace your interviews and land your dream job in tech. Exponent offers courses, one-on-one coaching, peer mock interviews, and a database of real interview questions. And I'm joined here today by Dan Baker at Hired.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Luke. It's good to meet you. Good to have this conversation. I'm excited to share a little bit about what we're doing at Hired, and specifically Hired assessments. I've been in tech since 2013. I've been in management for a lot of this, so I've done a lot of hiring. And currently, I'm the EM for the assessments product, where we are doing about 70 marketplace assessments a day for candidates on our marketplace trying to get roles, as well as additional assessments that are being done by our clients.
We're here today to discuss the State of Software Engineers report, and specifically, what are the top programming languages to get a job as a software engineer today? So this report was built from, I take it, 360,000 interactions between companies and candidates, and it covers a lot of the skills that companies mentioned they're seeking when hiring. So these are the skills that should make one the most employable candidate. The top coding skills and languages mentioned in the report are Go, Ruby on Rails, Scala, Ruby, and React Native. Those same skills were mentioned as the most in-demand skills for IC, individual contributors. And then for managers, the top mentioned skills were Rails, Scala, AWS, and Google Cloud. Additionally, that report mentioned that engineers' favorite programming languages of their own choosing were Python, JavaScript, Java, TypeScript, and C#, as well as Go. A few questions today for you about those. What did you find the most interesting about the top programming languages listed in this report?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think historically, I've definitely Ruby was. I remember like when I got started, Ruby was that killer language that was normal. Like it was easy for people to understand. It was the first language first language for a lot of people. I think it was a product called Ruby Cones. I don't know if you heard of this, but it was like the first coding tutorial that was like consumable to a non super techie person. And it's no surprise to me that, Ruby on Rails as being like the first usable framework has so much popularity. And here we are today in 2022, where there's probably not that many projects getting started in Ruby, but there's a ton of projects being maintained in Ruby. And I think what that kind of says to me is it really speaks to the legacy nature of coding, right? Like I think it's something like the most highest paid like programming skill is like, I think it's like it's some like banking software from like the 1980s. I can't remember what it's called. Some weird coding language I've never seen ever. Any sort of tutorial. I don't think there's much on it at all, but that's the highest paid because, these banks are using it and they're not going to recreate their systems. It's way too expensive for them to do it. So I think what's kind of jumps out to me the most is, things like Go and Scala, because, those are kind of seeming to be like languages that are newer and more on the rise, right? People aren't learning Go and getting Go engineers because they have to, because things built 10 years ago and exist in Go. It's because they want to build new things in Go. And I think to an extent, that's the truth with React Native, but I think that's more so just the nature of React just dominating the front-end framework landscape.
Mm-hmm. That is an interesting contrast in that, like, there's a number of technologies that obviously either that have been well established and kind of force newcomers to learn them just because of their staying power, as well as, as you mentioned, languages that are kind of on the rise like Go, that are kind of maybe the trendy new thing, and will also be employable for that reason. Do you encourage your team to regularly learn new technical skills? If so, what technical skills are your team members learning?
So I actually frame my advice to any of my direct reports more so around actually how we can frame the story for the resume for their next job, actually. I think about, okay, how can we sell this for you to get a promotion internally? And how can you sell this for yourself for your next roles in your future? And so usually it's less about the technology, it's more about solving a business case, because that's what's going to matter for the hiring manager in the future. And so the technology is usually secondary. Like for one of my engineers, they're like so deep in Terraform right now, I couldn't even tell you. And another one of my engineers, knows more about React and Vue than probably anybody else. And then another one of my engineers knows the ins and outs of Django in a way that probably very few people do. So I think that when I'm suggesting people learn new skills, it's really catered to the use case, 100%. If I was going to say to somebody who's just learning code, what would you learn? I think things like Rust are really exciting, right? Because it's a new language that is actually approaching programming from like a very type centric point of view, but also it's very low level control whilst having high level usability, which I think is interesting. But that's what I'm not going to suggest my engineers do, because it doesn't have a use case for our business.
Yeah, I guess we'll probably touch on this later, but there's kind of an interesting, there's often technologies that are probably best suited to solve a particular business case and are extremely important to learn for that reason, as well as there's technologies that are probably always very popular amongst engineering, and maybe just because they scratch an itch and they're kind of technically interesting, but maybe they are the wrong puzzle piece or they're maybe a bit too new for whatever you're trying to work on the job.
And I've seen a lot of times, I think companies have made the wrong decision by supporting engineers to do things that they're curious about that don't really well align with the business case. And what ends up happening is the current business case that they need for their business to move forward doesn't get satisfied. So the business doesn't move forward. They have to then pivot to something that does make sense. The engineer maybe gets a skill set, but the skill set isn't even that sellable. Mm-hmm. Why? Because it never was usable at the business.
What would you recommend for job seekers that don't know these top languages listed in the report? How can they stay competitive in their job search?
I think that, this is I think looking at this list, like the top 5 is interesting because it gives you the really heavy hitters on what languages people are looking for. And I think it depends on where you are in your career and how much you understand about where you want your career to go. Because for an engineer that maybe has a little bit of experience, knows has a pretty good idea of what they want to do, I would say, well, let's look in that subset, right? And maybe it doesn't matter what the top language is, more so what do you have some experience in, and is it going to be viable to enough potential employers, right? Because if we look at this list, I guarantee the people who are the best at Scale It don't know much about React Native, right? Mm-hmm. And so really it's more of a decision. Well, were you thinking about really doubling down in Angular 1? Maybe not do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's a good point. It's you're not gonna probably go out and become an expert in all of these. You definitely want to probably assess kind of where your own experience is and take it based on that. You work on the technical assessments product at Hired. Can you describe how technical assessments are designed to assess a candidate's skills, and how can a job seeker do well in these assessments?
My advice to any potential client using the product is to understand what an online technical assessment can do and what it can't. I think the biggest value add is not that you're going to get an automated, this candidate is right for you or this candidate is not right for you. You're going to have an asynchronous interaction, right? The candidate's going to do the assessment when it makes sense for them, and you're going to review their work when it makes sense for you. That's first and foremost. Then what you can do is actually go through and you can play back how they did what they did, and provided they're within an acceptable range of performance that you are interested in how they actually executed it, see if they were taking approaches that make sense to you, see if they were using coding patterns that you think show a level of expertise, right? And I think that is what on the other side of that, a candidate can take is say, okay, I'm trying to show my thinking here more than I am actually trying to solve a problem. And I think in some cases, yeah, they're looking, they're getting like so many good candidates that they're like only able to look at the top 99, like 1% of them. But honestly, if that's the case, like I don't think anyone really ever enjoys or does well in a game where only, the top 1% are winning. You want to find, a little bit smaller pond where you can actually show a connection to your employer and show that you thought out your work. So I'd say that for a candidate, unfortunately, the state of the industry in online assessments, lead code is still king. So, brush up on that because that's what most of these products are geared towards. I do see a trend slowly moving away from just the pure lead code questions towards more framework based questions that include, a file system, find the bug, fix the bug, create a new file, add a new pattern, right? And then we're actually seeing you think creatively how you actually interact within an existing structure, because that's going to be a lot more valuable to show me how you're going to actually perform in the role rather than you can do fizz buzz or do bubble sort.
Just speaking really anecdotally, I know in my own experience, I feel, and I have seen more interviews in which the company crafted kind of a test case in which it really more closely mirrored a real world coding situation in which you had to kind of diagnose a bug in a code base that kind of probably looked like what their actual code base looks like.
Yeah. And just kind of dovetail on that, did that make you more impressed with the company?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think like, one, there's kind of a sense that they care about your time and like are wanting to test skills that are very closely matching what you're going to be doing on the job, which is kind of a bit different than the more esoteric leet code tests that you may be doing. And it, yeah, so I think it does feel more valuable from a candidate perspective.
Well, actually, to just kind of dovetail off what you said about, your experience going through an interview and how it made you feel about the company, I think that's something that candidates need to be really aware of as they choose which companies they engage with, right? Because the truth is as somebody interviewing a candidate, I know that I am selling almost as much as I am evaluating, right? And the truth, and I think something that advice I'd give to candidates is to get a sense of how well the company you're interviewing with is selling you. And if they're not selling you at all, what does that tell you about the company and the culture that you're about to enter? If they're selling you 100% and they're not really evaluating, what does it tell you about the mess you're about to enter? Right. So I think there's a really healthy balance there where they care about you and what the experience you're having. At the same time, they're actually asking meaningful questions that are relevant to the role you're actually going for.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I think the technical interviewing experience you go through is to some degree will be like a proxy of, the engineering culture you enter. So that's going to be the best signal you have before you, sign the paper. You're going to have to be the judge at that point, whether kind of what the culture is at this company.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, this is a really old anecdote, but I remember when I was choosing a boot camp because I'm a boot camp kid from 2013, and I remember one of Dev Boot Camp was one of them that I interviewed with, and another one was App Academy. I ended up going to the App Academy, and they put me through like 4 different coding challenge that I had to submit as a part of the evaluation. And I remember Dev Boot Camp, they said, "Hey, here's a riddle," and it was like a word riddle that they just wanted me to video myself talking about the word riddle. And I was like, you guys, what the heck are you guys doing? Like, who are you trying to hire? A wizard? Like, what is this? And I think that's a note for candidates to know who they want to interact with. But I think it's also really important for employees or employers to kind of make sure that they're creating an experience that makes a candidate feel safe from their whole life cycle, from a candidate to an employee to an ex-employee. The biggest thing is one takeaway I'd get from looking at this is to definitely like look at these, understand where there is demand. And I think that it's really more important that you find the right demand supply ratio. And that could be one, right? If there's one person that needs one engineer of one type, then there you go. You can get that role and you can be happily ever after at that company. But if you just choose the one that is in the most demand, that also might be the most candidates going after that skill set as well. So, and I think that like it really matters most, what can you see yourself doing? Because at the end of the day, when you get the role, you got to show up and you got to do it and you got to not hate your life. So find something that you're interested in, because that's where you're going to be the best and that's where you're going to be able to succeed long term.
No, that's a fair point. If you have spent the last 5 years working in databases and think you need to learn React to be employable, but your passion is databases, that might not be the technology to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, and I think this is a challenge I get as somebody who's been an engineer, is that I remember like, 10 years ago, it was like JavaScript, JavaScript, JavaScript. I'm going for JavaScript. And, only recently have I really started really broadening my horizons and realizing like, oh, actually, at the end of the day, it's assembly code, right? And there's a lot of different ways to think about it. And if you want to do anything that actually, ships bits in a reasonably fast way, you got to actually think outside of the box of JavaScript, which I think is kind of interesting when you think of how it's playing out in the like the cryptocurrency space, right? Because Solidity is basically the JavaScript of cryptocurrency, which is nice because everyone knows JavaScript, but at the same time, it's the like most loosely typed language that exists, which maybe doesn't make sense when you're dealing with money on the internet, right? Which is what blockchain is essentially.
Yeah, and then I see you have newcomers pop up, obviously, and this is kind of true both in the cryptocurrency space and on the web generally, in which there's blockchains that are supporting contract execution in different languages, and then on the web, growing support for things like WebAssembly, meaning that the web app today no longer is exclusively JavaScript for your imperative code. You can use WebAssembly, the language of your choice, for maybe parts of your web app that are needing to be more performant. All of a sudden, there's hundreds of languages that can be compiled to WebAssembly, meaning there's hundreds of tools at your disposal to be writing web apps that didn't exist a few years ago.
Luke, actually, I think that's a really good point. I think the biggest takeaway from this, like the state of all these languages, is just to learn more languages, right? Because I think it's easy to think back about when you learn the language that you actually make your bread and butter with. Like, that was hard to learn. I don't want to do that again. Well, the truth is that every year that passes, the way that people learn coding languages is better and easier than it was the year before. I remember when Stack Overflow basically changed the game. There's a time that didn't even exist. You couldn't ask a question. You'd get a weird ass forum and you'd get like very esoteric responses that are, or you'd have to open a paper book, right? And so I think the big takeaway that a candidate should take is definitely learn a little bit about more languages and just realize you're never pigeonholed to one language.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, once you learn your first programming language, obviously your first is going to be the hardest. After that, you establish kind of mental models, you understand how to read documentation better, hopefully, and it's going to be so much easier to pick up new technologies after having mastered one or two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of also kind of speaks to how like more you start understanding like the real valuable concepts in programming, right? Like I think one book I'd recommend for everybody to read is JavaScript Design Patterns. And it actually goes through like, a lot of things that you need to do in programming to, write really complex code, right? Do people know? I mean, yeah, there is the specific stuff like hoisting that is JavaScript specific, but also, there's polymorphism. There's ways to, curry different functions to, build into other ones. There's direct inheritance, and understanding these more deeper patterns are going to make you a stronger programmer and then enable you to do a lot more powerful things. And I think that when an interviewer looks at a submission and says, oh, they're currying a function, that's an interesting way to approach. Even if you aren't able to do it, if they take a second to watch it, which we really encourage our clients to do, they'll see that you kind of know your chops, because at the end of the day, no business is making money by having the programmer who can write FizzBuzz the fastest.
Thanks a bunch, Dan, for joining me today. Definitely a lot of interesting stuff in this report from Hired. Always interesting to kind of see where the trends in technologies are going, and then also how that translate to what companies are hiring for. So it's really cool to have Hired put this together. To better prepare for your upcoming technical interview, I of course recommend Exponent's software engineering course. That's going to be linked in the description. Dan, do you have any recommendations on the Hired end?
I think, if you get on Hired and you start taking some assessments, maybe that's going to make you stand out a little bit more to employers, and we've seen that happen. But, before you do that, you want to do your best. And I think that if you head over to Exponent, you can really sharpen those skills to be in the place you need to be to get hired.
Cool. Well, thanks a bunch, Dan.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below to let us know that this video was valuable for you. And of course, check out hundreds more videos just like this at tryexponent.com. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your upcoming interview.